Guys, I've done it again. Um, so I always brainstorm and come up with theories and concepts, but I literally just cracked like the ultimate secret of existence. Like we literally basically this could be the ultimate proof of the creator and of existence and the purpose of everything. So I was laying down just a second ago and then I totally just figured out the ultimate secret of like everything, like to where you can nearly know 100% what the actual truth or what's actually expected to be going to happen. So I always kind of simplify and invert. I make everything equal and opposite, and then I balance the sides to make sense of where does everything begin to line up, and so anyway, I was sitting there, and I've said in a lot of my videos that we're in a holographic reality, so that's why when I have these holographic revelations, that it always kind of like one little point reveals every single other angle of the diagram, and it's almost like a laser that's shined into a mirror, and then when you shine the laser into the mirror exactly at the right angle, you'll see the laser bounce off infinite amounts of uh, you know boundaries, and then that's the whole point of like getting as focused as you can, as you want to line up that laser so that it lines up on every single aspect, every single dynamic. So here I'm gonna make a long story short, and we're just gonna dive straight into what I want to reveal. So what I just discovered, it's basically an analogy or a figure of speech in a good way to perceive, like what is actually the reality. So in this video, I'm titling it the actual revelation of the Big Bang. So that's what I was sitting there, you know, kind of passing out, and then I started having brainstorms of like, oh, how to explain the Big Bang, like in its most detailed and you know unified and simplified and most obvious source of what it has done. Basically, pointing directly only at what it has done, nothing else. Not theorizing anything that is outside of what is actually you're actually looking at. So I here's the revelation of the Big Bang. So when you're looking at the Big Bang, this is what I realized. Here, I want to make this a blackboard because I think it always looks a little cooler. Um, I um, so let's just imagine this is the Big Bang. It's not. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're just thinking, okay, everyone knows it's like getting blasted out of there. Um, but we'll just use a simple line. So what I was sitting there thinking was, okay, I there's been a saying from Einstein, whenever he gets his great theories and revelations, they come in dreams and then they just kind of flash in his mind, and they appear um, through, long hours of focused concentration through the past and the future. You always, it's like a 3D image. When you keep looking at it, it pops out. You'll see more and more detail. It's almost like a chessboard. When you keep staring deeper and deeper into a chessboard, more and more and more depths start popping out, popping out, popping out. So here's the revelation. Okay, so I was sitting here thinking, like, okay, if God exists, then everything is always going to make sense. It took me a while to come up with that quote, and I kind of reworded it after I was analyzing and calibrating it in my mind, and then inverting it, outverting it, inverting it, outverting it, and then I balanced it as precisely as I could. And that was as precise as I could get it for the moment. I would, if I keep calibrating it and stuff, I could maybe get it a little more precise. But I figured that this was precise enough to, basically present as a great discovery of the revelation of what's actually happening. So the revelation, and my revelations make most sense when explain the vocabulary and the definition of the language that has been selected to be used. So it's about being highly selective and highly understanding of what's been selected. So that's what I decided would be the most accurate to select is if God exists, then everything is always going to make sense. So it took me about 5 minutes to, add every little detail to that statement to where it seems to, bounce off every single angle and be complete. And here's why I believe that quote and that reality of what I realized is absolutely true and can almost not be disproven. And it would just be a matter of everyone's own opinion. Same with me. It's still kind of my matter of own opinion, but when enough people are going to look at a matter of own opinion, I'm sure enough people would conclude that, oh man, out of that matter of opinion, it actually makes the most sense. So out of a matter of opinion, this is what I have concluded. So if God exists, then everything is always going to make sense. So when you use that term, everything is always going to make sense, you have a few other options. You could say everything is always going to make expectation, which is, it could be A or B. You can use either or. So however you want to perceive it, use both. Actually kind of perceive it on A and B, so then it kind of sinks in deeper, which is kind of what I do. I notice that it's still the same thing, but when you add one other specific word, it makes it make more sense, and that's how I'm able to change words out to where it makes sense, because you can do that. You can change a word and then everything doesn't make sense. Okay, so if God exists, then everything is going to make sense. So then I had concluded, okay, that seems to be super accurate. So when I find the absolute most accurate definition on the yin side, because there's always the yin and the yang, what I do is I perceive the opposite, the other side, to make sense of, well, what would be the opposite? So now that's where my ability, I'm just so good at what I do, is I've done it for so many times that I can do it, and then it always makes the answer, boom, so obvious. So it took me about 5 minutes to invert the quote until I realized, oh, it's exactly right, because it can only either be A or B. So that's what I narrowed it down to. It can either only be A or B. Everything can always either be A or B. It's either everything's always going to matter or everything's not going to matter. So everything can be reduced and simplified to, okay, well, it's either A or B, A or B. It either is or it is not. It either is or it is not. So that's our greatest strength of being able to figure everything out is, it's either A or B. It's either A or B. Okay, so now that we've seen the ultimate answer, we know that that's the true answer. That's the answer, because the other answer can't be possible when you find the absolute truth. When you find the absolute truth, the opposite will reveal its falsehood and reveal the truth. So the secret is to find the falsehood, because once you find the falsehood, it reveals the truth. So here's the falsehood. Here's where you can invert it to the other side, because it can only be A or B. So if God exists, everything is going to make sense. So the complete opposite of that is, okay, well, if God doesn't exist, I don't want to spoil you people with the answers. I want people to think about this so then you can see how being selective on, your visualization abilities is imperative to being able to get results that are the actual truth, the expected value, because you can't see the expected value. You have to figure it out, and you have to know what it is. So we're not going to be able to see this unless we figure it out or we just know it. So the only way to figure something out is just based on if you know what you know. So this is just based off what everybody knows, and the only thing we do know. This is the only thing we do know. I mean, as far as for anyone who has not met God, that's all we can know. So since we have not met God, all we can know is that if He does exist, then we expect that everything is going to make sense. Okay, so and now on the opposite side, now I'm gonna make this make sense. This is where it'll all make sense. So I'm gonna spoil you guys and give you the answer. Here's the answer. Now the opposite, remember, you have to carefully invert it, because if you insert the wrong word, it's not correct. It doesn't make sense. Okay, here's an example of where if you insert the wrong word, it's not inverted. You didn't invert it. You didn't fucking make it the opposite. Here's where if you don't make it the opposite completely, then it doesn't make sense, and that's everyone's problem. They didn't visualize the exact opposite to where it became obvious of what the actual revelation or truth is. So here's the wrong way to invert it. Okay, so we're saying if God exists, then everything is always going to make sense. So if you don't invert it right, you may come to a conclusion of, okay, well, if God doesn't exist, then everything is never going to make sense. See, that's not the right way to invert it. Because you can't use the same everything on the quote when you're inverting it. So when you're saying if God doesn't exist, then everything is never going to make sense, you can't use that term everything, because it's the opposite. So you already used if God exists, then everything is always going to matter. So you can't use everything again, because it's got to be the opposite. So if God doesn't exist, then nothing is ever going to matter, or nothing is ever going to make sense. Nothing is ever going to make expectation. So that's the revelation. That's how we know there has to be God. That's what we expect. We expect that there has to be. There has to be, because it's what's expected. It's what we know. That's the only thing we know. That's the only thing we can come to know or expect, is that there has to be. And you can't know unless He never shows up. So if any point He ever shows up, then that doesn't prove that He doesn't exist. Because at any point, if He ever shows up, how can you say that now He doesn't exist if all He ever has to do is just show up? All He has to do is show up, and boom, now we know. Oh, He exists. He shows up. So now, if you want to go on your own little journey and try to figure out, well, why isn't He showing up? It's because we had to learn the hard way. This is what it looks like when you learn something the hard way. That's what happened. That's when you learn something the hard way, is when you don't listen. Adam and Eve, they didn't listen. They learned the hard way, because that's what's expected through humanity, through the law of that large numbers, the law of averages. So when you invert it correctly, the right way to say, well, if God does not exist, then nothing is ever going to make expectation. Nothing is ever going to matter or make sense. So why do you think that okay, so if God didn't exist, then nothing is ever going to make expectation. Nothing is ever going to make sense. Nothing's ever going to make expectation. And that's what it would look like if nothing ever made sense or nothing ever made expectation. There would never be anything, because if nothing ever makes sense, nothing ever makes expectation, then there's never anything. Nothing's ever there. Nothing ever makes sense. Nothing ever makes expectation. So when you're looking at something that never makes expectation or never makes sense, there's nothing there. It's nothing. Nobody ever knows anything. There's nothing. So it's the opposite, because we already seen, okay, everything's there. So we already know. So if God exists, then everything is always going to make sense. Everything is always going to make sense or make expectation. So when you look at the Big Bang, that's exactly all it's doing. That's all the Big Bang is doing, is making expectations. So when you look at the Big Bang, and if somebody asks, well, what is happening there? What happened right there? The revelation and the way to define what you're looking at based on the power of language, based on the power of truth, based on the power of knowledge, and being able to analyze what the hell is you're looking at. You actually it's undeniable proof that it makes the most sense that there has to be a God. And here's why. Because when you're looking at the Big Bang, you're basically looking at everything is making sense. That's where it's going. So where is the Big Bang going? So you notice from nothing, infinitely small, because you can go from infinitely small to infinitely big, either A or B. So God likes to use going from infinitely small, because it can be A or B. He can do either or. But it makes more sense to start with going from infinite small to getting bigger. Because he has that ability. He knows how to do that. Because that's his nature. He's a system, a machine. So when you're looking at the Big Bang, you're just looking at everything going to make expectations. So that's all the Big Bang has ever been doing. So when everyone's looking at, well, what is it doing? It's going to make sense. That's what it's doing. It's going to make sense. It's always going to make sense. It's always going to make expectation. Why do you think that it always is going to make it always? Because when you're first looking at it, it doesn't make sense, but it's going to make expectation. It's going to make sense. So that's like when you're saying you're going to the store. So you're not at the store until you get there, because it's going to. So that's what you're looking at with the Big Bang. Everything is going to make sense. It may not make sense right now because it's going to make sense. Everything is always going to make sense. Everything is always going to make expectation. Yeah, you guys got lit. Fuck all you little devil worshipping bitch ass motherfuckers. Burn in hell, bitch.